Today we celebrate the feast of the North American martyrs. There are 8 of them. 6 of them were priests, 2 of them were lay members of the Jesuits, and they had come to Canada in the 1600s, and they were all martyred at various times individually, roughly around the year 1645. And when we think of that period of time, it was very primitive. So most of them came from France. And, imagine, living here in North America and the mosquitoes, the black flies, and the harsh winters, what kind of harsh conditions they had to live in. And of course, they were constantly at threat by the various tribes of the natives here in Canada. Some of the natives were more friendly towards the white men, such as the Hurons, but the Iroquois were more of a warrior tribe, and they resented the white men, and they wanted to exterminate the white men at some point. So there were obviously clashes between them. Nevertheless, these individuals came from France to establish the faith here, to share the faith with the North American natives here, to basically bring salvation to them. And like I said, some of them were open to this, and some of them were not. Anyways, at one point, the Iroquois decided just to slaughter all the settlements, both the white men and the Hurons, and they went from village to village that had been established and attacked them, put them to fire, and killed most of the people. Whatever survivors there were, they took into captivity, making them slaves. And so the individual who perhaps sticks out the most is Saint John de Brébeuf. He was a great spiritual leader, and he was a very strong man physically also. But of course, all of them, not just the harsh conditions of the nature here, but even having to learn a new language, very difficult, right? So, yet they were willing to do this out of love for the natives here in Canada. Now, I wanted to draw your attention to today's second reading from Paul's letter to the Corinthians. Notice what he says: we have this treasure in clay vessels so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and does not come from us. This extraordinary power belongs to God and does not come from us. Well, what is St. Paul referring to? Well, maybe the power to do miracles, but even the very presence of God, it doesn't come from us. It's a free gift of God. When it comes to the North American martyrs, the manner in which they died is very heroic, especially certain individuals. And there was an incident with the St. Isaac Jogues. He had been captured by the Indians, and they had gnawed off his index finger. I know this part of the torture was that they would just chew on his finger, and they took great delight in causing him pain and suffering. So they had already done this previously, but on this occasion he was captured along with a Huron Indian, and the Iroquois forced this Indian, she was a female, to chop off his thumb, which initially she resisted, but then she went and chopped it off. Now, we know a lot of the events that took place. We have very good details regarding them, because the Jesuits would write back to France. They would send letters back and forth, and the letters that were sent later are referred to as the relations of the Jesuits here in North America. So there's actually a book that you can buy with these letters in there. So anyways, Isaac Jogues, he later wrote back, saying that his thumb was chopped off, and what he did right after that, we would scream with pain, and we would be so angry or whatever. But he said he picked up his thumb with his other hand, I don't know which hand it was, and he offered it to God as a sacrifice. In other words, he wasn't angry, he wasn't resentful. He just accepted this as a sacrifice that he would offer to God on behalf of those who were persecuting them, for the conversion of those natives who were so opposed to Christianity. And as I mentioned, St. John de Brébeuf, he was the great spiritual leader, and he was also very strong. And amongst the natives, they admired physical strength. And so Jean de Brébeuf, when they were notified that the Iroquois were coming to attack their village, most of the people fled, but some remained to try to defend the village, and Jean de Brébeuf decided to stay behind to comfort those who would be engaged in the battle, but also to baptize those who were preparing to be received into the church to be baptized. So he baptized them. Anyways, the village was attacked, it was burned, he was captured. And this was in the spring, I can't remember which year, but in the 1640s. And there was still snow on the ground, so it was still quite cold, but they stripped him naked, and they took his fingernails and they plucked out his fingernails and his toenails, and they forced him to march back to their camp. And once there, he had to run the gauntlet. So in other words, 2 rows of Indians, each one with a club or a stick or whatever. He would run through, and as he ran through, each one would strike him, they would hit him. So extreme pain. Then they tied him to a post and proceeded to torture him. And they wanted this torture to last a long time, because they knew that he was a great spiritual leader, so they wanted to make an example of him. Now, he wasn't the only one captured. There were other Huron Indians that were also captured, and they were the ones who would later relate the story. And the Iroquois knew that these Hurons would also spread the news of how he was tortured. And basically the message they were trying to give is, look, if you become a Christian, if you support the white men, this is what's going to happen to you also. So anyways, they proceeded to stab him with a sharp metal object, and they did various things to him. And at one point, they scalped him while he was still alive, and they poured boiling water over him 3 times in mockery of baptism. Then they took some axe heads and put it into a fire, got them red hot, and then strung them together with a vine and put them around his neck, so that if he would lean forward or backward, he would just be burned by these axe heads. So tremendous pain. At one point, they put bark around him and lit it on fire. He wasn't completely burned, but we all know that being burned is extremely painful. At one point, they took a knife and cut slices of flesh off his thighs and ate it. So during this whole time, he kept looking at his torturers with love, and he continued to preach to them, trying to get them to convert. So yes, he was in pain, and I'm sure he must have moaned and groaned, but he wasn't just manifesting his pain, he was more focused on their conversion. And eventually they couldn't stand the fact that he just continued to preach to them, and they were just amazed, like, how can he have the strength to be able to endure all these sufferings and to look at us with love and to preach to us? So they resented it. So they cut off his lips, cut out his tongue, and stuffed his mouth, but he continued to look at them with love. So anyways, it was long, prolonged torture lasting a very long time. And eventually, they cut open his chest and plucked out his still beating heart, and they ate it. And the reason they ate it is because they wanted to capture his spirit. They wanted to capture his strength. And, how is it that Jean de Brébeuf was able to endure such suffering, such torture, and to look with love at those who were torturing him? And, I alluded to today's second reading from Paul, the second letter of Paul to the Corinthians. We have this treasure in clay vessels so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God. In other words, God was in Jean de Brébeuf. God was strengthening Jean de Brébeuf. And in fact, we have evidence of this from other saints, other martyrs, and the account of their suffering, in particular, Saints Perpetua and Felicity. So they were thrown into the arena in the early church, and the wild animals came, and there were bulls, and the bulls would throw them and, pierce them with their thorns, and their horns, rather. And then they were taken out of the arena, and then they were sent back in. So when they were taken out, they had a chance to relate that, it wasn't so bad. My sufferings weren't so bad. It's Christ who's suffering in us. It's Christ who's giving us the strength. Christ is alleviating our pains and our sufferings. And so they had the courage to face even further sufferings and eventual martyrdom. But you see, there's a very, very important lesson here for all of us. And that is that in our lives, we all experience sufferings of one sort or another. Sometimes it's psychological or spiritual, or sometimes it's physical. But we are not alone. And if we only turn to Christ, if we would only turn to Christ and trust in Him and ask Him for the grace that we need, then our sufferings become so much easier to bear. And the ideal is that we unite our sufferings with those of our Lord. And when we do that, our sufferings become redemptive. They can help to atone for our past sins, but they can also help to draw down God's graces upon the entire world. And this is something wonderful. So suffering, yes, we should avoid or alleviate suffering as much as we can, but there are times when we simply cannot. And so either we become miserable and get angry with God or get angry with the people around us, or we take that suffering and we turn it into good. And God has the ability to transform evil into good, as He did through the martyrdom of these North American martyrs. Now, unfortunately, their influence kind of didn't last, and not just amongst the natives here, but amongst all Canadians. We're kind of turning away from God. Not kind of, but we are turning away from God, which is very, very unfortunate. So they are the secondary patrons of Canada. So we should especially ask them, please pray for Canada. Convert Canada, convert Canadians, but also give us the courage that we need to face hardships, to be courageous in the face of opposition, to be able to proclaim the truth, the message of salvation, the message of love for everyone. Just a reminder, we have a funeral on Monday at 10:30 for Jayendran Rajendran. May his soul and the souls of all the faithful departed through the mercy of God rest in peace. Also tomorrow we have the walking pilgrimage to St. Barnabas. We will be leaving after the morning Mass at 10 a.m. We will meet outside the church. Those of you who don't think you can walk the entire journey, we're going to stop at Our Lady of the Rosary as well as St. Bartholomew. So you can go there, meet us there, go from there, or if you don't want to go all the way, that's okay also. There is a wedding at St. Barnabas, so the pastor has asked that we try to get there for around noontime. So ideally, we don't want to be too much later than that. So just so that we don't interfere with their wedding.